Okay, welcome back everybody. Today we are going to talk about, today and the next lecture, we are going to talk about the issue of pornography. Today specifically, we are going to talk about Helen Longino's article, Pornography, Oppression, and Freedom. She's going to express one view. Tomorrow, Feinberg is going to express a contrary position. So before I begin, let me make the disclaimer. I understand pornography is an issue that a lot of us might be uncomfortable with. But it is a major moral issue in our modern society. I imagine the more uncomfortable with it you are, the more you recognize that this is something that bears consideration when we're talking about what things are morally normal, right? It's never been a bigger issue for us. The prevalence of it is obviously beyond the imaginations of the people who are writing, like Longino, circa 1980, right? She's writing in a time when there's sort of a boom in the pornography industry. But even back then, you had to drive. If you wanted to see a pornographic material, you had to drive to a store and buy, and spend money to buy videos. Even though back in 1980, a video recorder was pretty rare. Probably you went to a peep show or you went to a adult theater or something like that. So it was a whole process, something done in the sort of dark places. These days now, anybody with an internet connection has access to material that would shock the conscience of even the most avid porno theater goer circa 1980, right? So this is so the morality of this and the legality of pornography. These issues are not something that have only grown in importance, arguably, since 1980. So, okay, now let's talk about what pornography is. So you got to watch philosophers. You got to make sure they define their terms properly. And as we will see, there's going to be a lot writing on how Longino defines the term pornography. So, and people's definitions of pornography are going to be different, right? Normally, the way that most people use the word pornography, they generally just use it as a catch-all term for anything that's sort of sexually explicit and doesn't really have any sort of other kind of artistic content, right? So, a movie that has a sexually explicit love scene doesn't count as pornography because there's the rest of there's the rest of the movie around it, right? So it's going to have to be, so it's something that's sexually explicit, and it's sexually explicit in a way that isn't meant to serve any larger narrative or any larger artistic purpose, but is simply intended to cause arousal, right? That is kind of the normal understanding of what pornography is. Now, in addition to that, other people have come along and added and over the years defined pornography with some other elements. Pornography is often described as obscene, meaning, what does obscene mean? There's a very famous, sort of infamous quote from a Supreme Court justice in the 1940s that, I don't know what obscenity is, but I know it when I see it, right? Generally, something that is obscene is something that is offensive to normal people, right? Who are the normal people? I know them when I see them, I guess, right? So it's contrary to normal actions, to the common standards of society, and it's going to be offensive to normal people, right? In addition to that, maybe because of its obscenity, some people think that pornography is harmful. Now, who does it harm? Well, some people, there are a few people it might harm. It might harm the consumer of pornography. It might harm the person watching it, in that it might twist their attitudes towards sexuality or towards women, for instance. It might twist people's ideas of sex. It might be offensive to the moral standard, the general moral standards of the society, or of your religious beliefs, right? So there might be this general kind of harm that pornography causes through its obscenity. Finally, some people, particularly the feminists, want to add specifically that pornography has the specific character of being harmful and debasing to women, right? So now let's talk about that sort of beginning to end, and who believes what about pornography. So here are going to be the elements of our definition of pornography. First of all, it's sexually explicit. It is sexually explicit movies, images, or literature, not for any real artistic purpose, but its real intention is simply to sexually arouse, right? And now we get into some of the questionable territory. I think 1 and 2 represent the sort of general idea of what pornography is. Now we get into the more moral dimensions of it, right? It is some people commonly say that pornography is, by its definition, obscene. That is, it's offensive to normal people or normal behavior, and through that obscenity, it's harmful. It's harmful to the general public, the general standards of society, the general attitudes of people. Finally, the feminists especially emphasize that it constitutes a real and direct harm to women. And so we can say that I didn't put the liberal definition of pornography up here because liberals generally are iffy about the whole idea of labeling something as pornographic and saying that it has no artistic merit or no artistic content at all. But generally, the common view, as I said, is that generally we can all agree that at the very least pornography is sexually explicit and exists only to cause sexual arousal. Now, the conservative definition, the definition of social conservatives, emphasize 1 through 4. They accept and emphasize 1 through 4. They accept that it's obscene and that it is harmful. They emphasize, though, the damage that it does to traditional values, particularly traditional family values, and to the spirit and mentality of people, right? Feminists like Longino think that the real issue, though, is the most direct and most present harm of pornography is the damage that it does to women, right? And she thinks conservatives and feminists typically don't agree about much, but on the issue of pornography, they generally agree that the state has an interest in limiting or even censoring pornographic material, right? They disagree about why. The conservatives tend to think that the state has an interest in limiting pornographic material because it does harms to values and institutions. Feminists think that the state has an interest in ought to censor pornographic material because it directly damages women. Right. So now, let's talk about those views in some depth. Okay. So now let's clarify a couple positions that you might have with regard to pornography. In the first case we talked about, there is the conservative view. And on the conservative view, pornography is so harmful that the government should censor it, right? That there ought to be at least some restrictions on pornography, if not an outright ban, right? This is in contrast to generally and again, these are both painting with broad brushes, but the general liberal view, on the other hand, is that pornography may or may not be harmful, but we know that political censorship is harmful. We know that restrictions on freedom of expression tend to be abused by the government, and that it tends to be and they tend to gravitate. They tend to accelerate. Once you've opened the door a little bit, you get more and more censorship, right? So the liberal view tends to be that pornography might be bad, but it's not as bad as censorship, right? Now, this liberal view we want to emphasize for a moment. It's based on what's called the harm principle. The harm principle was named and articulated by John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian. But you can also find something very similar to it defended in by a variety of other authors, including John Locke. And the harm principle is specifically about the nature, the relationship of the government and the people. The harm principle says the government should not restrict a behavior or a practice simply because it's immoral, or we don't like it. The harm principle says that the government should only restrict actions that actively cause harm to other people. And this sort of puts name to an idea that's been sort of brewing here in ethics for a while, in my ethics class for a while, that just because we think something is wrong doesn't mean the government ought to ban it or make it illegal. That kind of separation of the immoral from the illegal is sort of central plank of the social contract theory that we talked about in the second part of class, right? So, but also endorsed by the utilitarian John Stuart Mill. So so these are the views we want to talk about. To get these clear, the conservative view on pornography is that pornography is so harmful to people and values that the government should censor it. The liberal view is that pornography may be harmful, maybe not, but it may be harmful, but it is not as harmful as censorship. Censorship tends to hurt people and society much, much more than pornography. And the liberal view is based on the harm principle, which says that actions can only be restricted by the government if they harm others, if they are harmful to other people. And we generally take that, I think we generally accept that in our American society, based on our own idea of the freedom of expression and our own pursuits of happiness. That nobody should get involved in what I want to do to myself, in the privacy of my own home, so to speak, right? If it doesn't harm anybody else, right? Now, important to people on all sides of this debate, of course, is the issue of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. This is more than a good idea. This is the law. This is spelled out explicitly in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right? So we all have, by our most basic and fundamental law, we as citizens of the United States have the freedom to express ourselves without the government coming in to shut us down. This is an important issue that gets confused, by the way, in a lot of our current debate about freedom of speech. A lot of people complain, well, if you're boycotting my product because you don't like my political views, and that's violating my freedom of speech, right? But that's not what the First Amendment is about. The First Amendment is about what the state can do, not about what the populace can do. If people don't want to buy your product because they don't like you, they are perfectly entitled to do that, and that's not a First Amendment issue, not a legal First Amendment issue. So maybe it's a spiritual First Amendment issue, I don't know. But the First Amendment says nothing about protecting you from the consequences of your expression. So anyway, important to everybody on this debate, the freedom of expression. It's particularly important to liberals, however. The liberals say that, well, the freedom of expression, freedom of speech is so important that it means that we must always side with the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, even when that means defending something that we find really personally, morally offensive. And some people might good people might find certain pornographic material very seriously morally offensive. But on the liberal view, nonetheless, we should defend people's right to engage in producing it and to engage in consuming it on principle, because the legal principle of freedom of expression is more important than our own personal morals, right? Now, all of that is meant as sort of an introduction to the contours of the debate on pornography. Now let's get into specifically what Longino thinks about pornography. Okay. Now, what Longino is going to do now is she's going to develop a position that is actually a third position with regard to the conservative versus liberal conversation or sides that I just laid out. Her view, she calls it feminist. A lot of feminists reject this view, though, by the way. This becomes a very controversial flashpoint and maybe the most important philosophical feminist issue of the 1980s, the arguments about sex and pornography that go on in the 1980s. So we don't want to make the mistake and I might refer to her position as the feminist position. If I do that by accident, sorry to any feminists out there who reject her positions. I'm in fact a feminist who rejects her positions, or at least some of her positions. Yes. So let's proceed. So Longino's position is this. She says that we all love freedom of expression, and we all accept the harm principle. But in fact, pornography ought to be, even though we like the First Amendment and we accept the harm principle, pornography ought to be censored because it harms women, right? How does it harm women? Well, it harms women in, she says, at least three ways. In the first case, she says that it is implicated in violence against women, meaning that she says that there is a link, the nature of which is not spelled out here and is very controversial, but nonetheless, there is some link between pornography and violence against women, real world violence against women, not just in the production of pornography, but out in the world, that a man watches a pornographic show or movie, right? And that primes him in some way, makes him more likely to go out and actually harm women or engage in violence against women, right? So that's the first way. It's implicated in violence against women. The second way that Longino says that pornography harms women in a way so serious that it ought to be banned is that she says that it lies about women because it promotes this idea that women are subordinate to men and that women are deserving of and might even enjoy sexual violence, right? Depending on which pornographic film you're watching, right? So pornography lies about women. It amounts to, Longino says, a kind of anti-woman propaganda, that it spreads this idea of women that they deserve punishment and deserve violence. And thirdly, because of that, it reinforces general sexist attitudes about women, and therefore contributes to the social oppression of women, right? The idea here being that, if you're a man who is regularly consuming pornography, and that is part of your image of women, that it seems obvious that that is going to infect your view of women when you leave your house and go to work and deal with your wife or deal with your teachers at school or students, right? So the idea of it's not that the image of women in pornography is not separable from men's general attitudes towards women, right? And therefore, if these three things are true, Longino says that these constitute a kind of harm to women that justifies censorship, and that is more important than our freedom of expression. So, Longino's view is that pornography harms women in at least three ways. First, it is implicated in violence against women. That is, there is some sort of link, statistically, between the consumption of pornography and the and actual violence against women. Two, it lies about women by saying that they are subordinate to men and deserve and maybe even sometimes enjoy sexual violence. And three, that it reinforces sexist attitudes and contributes to the sexual oppression of women and contributes to a general social milieu where women feel are subject to oppression and are considered secondary citizens, objects rather than people, right? Oh, excuse me. I have to deal with a cat. Pornography, then, Longino says, presents a real danger to women. So why not censor it? What are the arguments against censoring it? And the arguments against censoring it come from the liberals, come from the people in the liberal tradition. And Longino says that those arguments tend to there are three such arguments that work together, right? In the first case, she says, liberals typically say, well, we shouldn't ban pornography, even if it's offensive, even if it's harmful. We shouldn't ban pornography because a ban would represent an unjustified intrusion upon the private lives of individuals. That, hey, what I do in my own home, on my own time, behind closed doors, is my own business and nobody else's business, just as a fundamental principle. So the second reason that liberals tend to give for defending the rights of pornographers and the merchants of pornography is that pornography, even if we don't like it, it represents a legally protected speech. It represents a legally protected form of expression. And it's just flat out unconstitutional to go around and saying, well, yes, there is an alleged freedom of speech, but not for kinds of speech that offend us, right? Thirdly, the liberals tend to say that any sort of censorship or ban that we place on censorship is not going to stay just on censorship. Inevitably, that same logic is going to be extended to other forms of expression, and we just can't trust the government to contain its power once it's taken hold of that power, right? And today it's pornography. Tomorrow it's other kinds of things that are considered offensive, and eventually it's going to be some forms of political speech, right? So liberals, again, are the people who are in the political and philosophical tradition of John Locke, right? And John Locke, remember, was very, very suspicious about the powers of government and thought the government ought to be very, very small and ought to limit itself only to protecting our central human rights. And anything else that we want to do on our own time is nobody's business but our own, right? So, pornography presents a threat to women. Why not censor it? Well, Longino says there are three traditional liberal arguments. One is that a ban would represent an unjustifiable intrusion on the private lives of individuals. What I do in my own home is nobody's damn business. Two, it is legally protected speech. We may not like it, but the Constitution doesn't say, that we have freedom of speech unless people find it icky or offensive. It says that the freedom of speech shall not be infringed, right? And thirdly, the liberals say that the effects of censorship are never contained. that censorship would inevitably lead to censorship of pornography would inevitably lead to other forms of censorship, right? So Longino is going to tell us why she thinks these three traditional liberal arguments don't work, and why she thinks then the right thing to do is to ban pornography. So what does Longino make of these liberal arguments? Well, she's against them. Why? Well, in the first case, remember, to the first point that that a ban on pornography represents a kind of unjustifiable intrusion into the private lives of the people who would consume it. Longino says, well, there's nothing private about pornography, right? It's not just you and maybe another person doing it in your bedroom. It's commercial, right? They have to they're producing a product, they're advertising a product, they're selling a product. To say that your consumption of a product an item that's produced and commercialized is private doesn't fly, Longino says. So the privacy argument, she says, is sort of the easiest one to dispose of. Secondly, the second liberal argument, remember, was that pornography is protected speech. As loathsome as some of us might find it, it is protected by the First Amendment. To this, Longino says that, well, the First Amendment has its limitations. Freedom of expression has some famous exceptions, right? The most famous being that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater and claim, well, I have the right to free expression, right? Expression that creates a clear and present danger can be censored. And that, fire in the crowded theater is just one example of the ways that we sometimes limit speech because it has some clear, it does some clear harm, right? Thirdly, to the claim that pornography would lead to other forms of censorship, that you can't just ban pornography without also threatening other forms of without expanding government powers in a way that threatens other forms of expression. Longino says, well, we already said that there are some exceptions to the First Amendment, and if we specifically target those kind of specific cases, we don't take those exceptions to be a sort of general threat to liberty. Now, so if we agree that it's harmful, if we think that harm is specific and real, then putting limitations on that kind of harmful expression, she says, doesn't present a general problem, right? So, Longino says pornography is not private; it is commercial. It involves production, it involves advertising, it involves payment. So it's commerce. It's not a personal choice. The freedom of expression has some limits, and pornography is harmful, right? So the limits of freedom of expression tend to be, well, and you have freedom of speech until it presents a clear and present danger to someone else, right? And Longino says, well, pornography meets that standard. It presents a kind of clear and present danger to women. Thirdly, to the idea that we can't keep the monster in the box, and that by censoring pornography, we're inevitably going to be censoring other kinds of expression, Longino says the suppression of specific kinds of expression known to be harmful, like screaming fire in a crowded theater, or the other famous example is libel. These aren't taken to normally represent a threat to liberty. Libel being the writing something that slanders you or defames you unfairly, right? Writing harmful lies about you, right? That's not protected speech. If you're if you're not a public figure, if you are a public figure, you're mostly outside the libel laws. But if you're just a private person, somebody writing something that is writing vicious lies about you just because they don't like you, or you broke their heart or something like that. That doesn't constitute protected speech, and people can be sued for libel, right? So Longino ends with the position that even if we generally accept the liberal attitude towards freedom of expression and towards the harm principle, still we ought to support censorship of pornography, as the damage that it does to women is real. It damages women individually, and it damages them as a group, right? So let's look at a different kind of summary of her argument. Okay, so before we go any further, today's attendance password is refrigerator. You can summarize it as fridge if you don't want to feel like typing not that much, or if spelling is not your bag. Longino's argument can be summarized in this way. A lot of you are doing your course objectives worksheet this week, so we're going to make use of some of what you hopefully have learned from the course objectives worksheet. We can summarize Longino's argument this way. If pornography harms women, then it should be censored. It harms women, therefore pornography should be censored. So, hopefully you realize that this is a form of modus ponens. This is the logical form of modus ponens, that if P then Q, P, therefore Q, right? So, and this has the form, this has a valid argument form. So this argument is valid, meaning, hopefully you know this too, meaning that if 1 and true are true, 3 must be true. And that is absolutely the case in this, under these circumstances, that if pornography harms women, then it should be censored. It in fact harms women, therefore pornography should be censored. Right. Now, one thing worth noting here, and we're going to get into a little logical technicality here. But one thing worth noting here is that, Longino defines pornography as essentially harmful to women. So pornography, she says, is by definition harmful to women. But pornography is by its definition harmful to women, then premise 2 here turns out to be what we call trivial or totally unsurprising, and in a way that's logically cheating, right? And this is an example of a logical fallacy, or call it a logical problem, called begging the question. You've probably heard the term begging the question used in modern parlance. Almost certainly you have used it or heard it used wrongly. In philosophy or logic class, begging the question is when you commit the error that Longino is committing here, where you define one of your terms in a way that assumes or takes for granted something that is going to be an important premise later on, and therefore your conclusion doesn't turn out to be any extra bit of knowledge. It turns out to be just sort of snuck in. It's a kind of logical shell game, right? Now, I've actually sort of foisted this logical problem on Longino just to point this out. It isn't necessary. We could state this argument in another way. The argument stated this way is begging the question. We could state Longino's argument in different ways that would reduce or minimize the problem that I'm talking about. Maybe not a huge problem, but it's worth noting since you did the work on your course objectives worksheet. Maybe you know some of this. Now we're applying some of those concepts, right? So, I'm going to, normally at this time, I would get into some critical analysis of Longino's argument and say, okay, what are the problems or the shortcomings here? Where is this argument strong and where does it fall short? I, however, don't want to take away from my next lecture on Feinberg because he does a pretty good job. He's not directly responding to Longino, but he does a good job of summarizing the problems with her argument or the problems that come up with arguments of this kind that she's making. And so I don't want to cannibalize tomorrow's lecture. I will end up on a footnote of saying a little bit about what Longino has in mind. And Longino and people on her side in that wing of feminism, what do they have in mind whenever they talk about banning pornography? Are they talking about throwing people in jail or kicking in doors, or throwing merchants in jail if you sell pornography or people who produce pornography? And it's interesting to look back that historically the answer to that is no. Longino is writing, as I said, she's in the 1980s. In literature and in law, there begins to be this war over this issue among feminists and liberals, right? With people like Longino and other people like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine MacKinnon saying that pornography is essentially harmful to women and ought to be censored. And other people arguing that even if we find it offensive, we shouldn't ban it, right? So what do they have in mind for a ban? And it's interesting that the proposed ban by Catherine MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin on pornography. They worked in Minneapolis, actually, with the local government to work on an ordinance to try to stop the proliferation of adult bookstores and adult theaters, right? And the means to do that MacKinnon and Dworkin came up with was to not throw anybody in jail, but rather simply to guarantee the rights of women to sue for redress when they are harmed by pornography, whether they are harmed in the production of pornography or whether they feel they have been harmed as a result of their husband who beat them or their rapist consuming pornography, right? And that nobody gets thrown in jail, but then they can be entitled to some. Hang on a second. They can be compensated for it, right? It would constitute an incursion on their civil rights, a violation of their civil rights, right? This, however, is enough to send a shiver up the spine of the pornography industry, much more than a shiver, a full-out panic on the part of those in the pornography industry. And eventually the MacKinnon and Dworkin proposal is struck down. It's proposed, it fights its way almost to the Supreme Court, but it's struck down before the Supreme Court, and the local court's decision stands that it's unconstitutional, finding that pornography is in fact a kind of protected speech, right? So anyway, just an, I think, interesting footnote. So tomorrow we are going to talk about Feinberg's reply to this this argument that pornography presents a clear and present danger to the lives of women and therefore ought to be banned. So, okay, guys, I will see you later.